Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for July 8th, 2024. Well, we're in a moment now where following the July 4th weekend in the United States, we're in a developing and deepening crisis worldwide, a political crisis, an economic crisis, one with a threat of an expanding war. The proxy war in Ukraine could go out of control, especially if NATO continues to supply weapons and target sites in Russia. You have a possibility of a regional war in Southwest Asia, in which case the Israelis would be looking at going into Lebanon, the possibility of a war with Iran, and so on. And then on top of that, you have the targeting of China, which has not stopped. A continued discussion in the European Union and in the United States of the threat to the West from China, which I would argue is not only a non-existent threat, but one which has been created for the purposes of a continuing military buildup and a further escalation of war. Now, the NATO summit is about to take place in Washington. Starts tomorrow. Most of the NATO leaders will be there, and they say their mission will be to build NATO to stop Putin from taking over the world. The line, of course, is based on false narratives that Putin intends to revive the Russian or the Soviet Empire, that Putin, if he's not stopped in Ukraine, will conquer all of Europe, that therefore the Europeans and the Americans have to form a much more aggressive coalition. You need a NATO military buildup, and of course, who benefits from this? The military-industrial financial complex, the BlackRocks, the companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin that will supply the weapons for a continuing war. Now, this is happening in spite of the obvious response of voters in Europe against the war. Whatever else you glean from the elections that just took place in the United Kingdom and France, the reality is that the voters are extremely unhappy. In the United Kingdom, they voted out the Tories. They crushed the Tories. But Starmer, who's coming in as the head of the Labour Party, reasserted as his first priority continuing the support for Ukraine against Russia. In France, Macron was crushed. They did a kind of electoral maneuver to prevent the National Rally Party, the Le Pen party, from becoming the government. But the reality is that the voters are opposed to the policy of the economic policy and the war policy, but the new coalition government, whatever form it is, will probably continue to support the war in Ukraine. In Germany, the coalition was crushed in the European Union parliamentary elections, and yet they're continuing to push the same policy. And in the United States, you have a situation with Biden, which both the Democrats and Republicans, those who are for and against him, nevertheless, all of them support the continuation of the war. They say Biden's policy on Ukraine is good, and it's too bad he's so old and decrepit. Well, it may be that we're seeing a regime change coup in the United States based on what? A fear of Trump. If Trump gets in, maybe he'll turn against this war policy. And so that may be the real reason that they're suddenly discovering that Biden is old and unable to complete sentences and stand at a podium, because they want to get rid of him and put someone else in to stop Trump from being elected. We'll be taking a look at that over the next days. Now, the NATO summit, the intention is to go for an overall military buildup. But there's a proverbial upsetting of the NATO apple cart. And by the way, the apple cart is filled with rotten apples. But that is in the person of Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who just finished a major tour with a mission of peace. He met with Zelensky first, and he found that Zelensky was not really open to the discussion. Of course, Zelensky just completed this phony peace conference based on the idea of a Russian surrender. But then he met with Putin, and then he met with Xi Jinping. And in both of those meetings, they had broad discussions of moving from the war direction to a new architecture of mutual security. And in fact, coming out of China, it may be that Orban was talking about support for the China-Brazil policy for peace in Ukraine, which is much closer to Putin's proposal, which the West refused to take up. Now, Orban may be coming now to the United States for the NATO summit. If so, expect a real kerfuffle over that. Meanwhile, what Orban's mission represented was an effort to bring to Europe this whole idea of the Eurasian security architecture that Putin initiated with his recent meetings. Now, why is this important? Well, the economies in Europe are heading downward again, especially in France and Germany. And the need for a mutual beneficial cooperative relationship along the lines of endorsement of the Belt and Road Initiative of China and support for the Global South, for the development of sovereign nations in the Global South, is really the key to the future. So now is the time for change. The smug NATO officials are not so smug. There are reports that there's uneasiness, that there's fear that the Orban initiatives will distract from the necessity for a buildup. And so what's the narrative? Well, Orban is meeting with authoritarian leaders, that he doesn't represent Europe, even though he's Hungary is the president of the European Council for the next 6 months. That his peace proposal is based on capitulation to Putin. Or you might turn it around. Is war based on capitulation to the military-industrial financial complex in the West? And so these battles are taking place right now in real time, where the truth is not being presented to you, but the narratives are for permanent war, permanent confrontation, permanent buildup, and permanent austerity. Now, what Orban said after these meetings is that the mission of NATO is peace, not permanent war. It will be very interesting if he shows up in Washington in the midst of this NATO summit. Now, meanwhile, the LaRouche movement has maintained its commitment to the idea that we must move to a new security architecture which guarantees the security of all nations. And the best guarantee for that is a mutually beneficial economic policy for cooperation for development. And that all nations have that as a common interest. That the West must drop the idea that the unipolar order is the only way to maintain stability, the so-called rules-based order, which has no real serious rules, and repeatedly its nations violate international law. So the question is, can we get the Western governments to drop this idea of the unipolar order and move toward a mutual common interest approach with the global majority, the vast majority of mankind, which is not for these wars and not for the austerity policies coming out of Washington, London, and Brussels? That's a question that you'll determine. And I'm urging you to join us in supporting the resolution that was adopted at the last International Peace Coalition meeting, which will be linked in the description box below. This is an incredible moment. The vacuum in the West is clear. No matter how they manipulate the situation in France or the United Kingdom or in the United States, the parties that are at the center are all war parties. They're committed to continuing the confrontation between East and West. But the people don't want war, but don't really know what to do. What's necessary now is leadership. And the leadership is not going to come from the political parties. It's not going to come from the replacement of Biden if Biden is replaced for the election against Trump. The leadership has to come from the people. And that's why we have this resolution, and that's why I'm urging you to join us in signing it and getting it circulated and getting it into the hands of people who can do something with it. So thanks for joining me today. As I said, the NATO summit begins tomorrow. It's going to be an extremely interesting period ahead, and I think you will appreciate having this daily update to give you some reality as opposed to the narratives.